I'd like to preface this video by saying that this is a 9-part compilation series, with the first video being posted 76 days before the final video. Therefore, as you can imagine, these videos do gradually get better with each, video. So therefore, if the current video you're watching does not meet your standards, then I put timestamps down below. So I want you to use the timestamps to skip to the next video in this compilation series until eventually, and then skip to the next video, and the next video, and the next video, until eventually you find one that meets your standards, okay? Trust me, each and every video is better than the last. On the morning of the 12th of March, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia controlled an empire spanning tens of millions of square kilometers and over 100 million people. 48 hours later, he had lost control of the entire country. He lost all of that in the time it takes to have a camping trip. That's got to be some kind of record. In this video, I'll cover the eventful tale of the end of the Romanov dynasty, full of riots, revolution, and betrayal, ending with the abdication of a man who, hours earlier, believed he could control Russia for years to come, finally surrendering his throne as an angry mob mauled his political apparatus piece by piece. Let's get to it! In 1917, in the Russian capital city, the food situation was awful. World War I had raged on the continent for 3 years at this point, and it had gradually ruined the ability of the Russian people to consume food. So, on the 8th of March, protesters flocked to the streets of Petrograd to protest. But they weren't just demanding more food, they wanted regime change. When the protesters took to the streets that day, they yelled slogans such as, "Down with autocracy." In Russia, Tsarism had become so unpopular, the masses wanted it gone. Meanwhile, on the same day, a wage dispute occurred at the Kornilov metalworks. The employees claimed that the managers were underpaying them, and in response to that, the workers were locked out of the building and told to back down or they would never be given work again. But being locked out meant the workers had nothing to do. And do you know what people do when they have nothing to do? They overthrow governments. Exactly right. And so, those 20,000 metalworkers with nothing to do joined the protests, bringing the number of protesters up to 90,000. On day 2 of the protests, the number of protesters increased to 197,000. The protesters wanted to reach the city centre, because that's where the aristocracy lived, and they wanted to protest right outside of the aristocracy's houses. They lined up at the banks of the Neva River and got ready to cross, but the police blocked the bridges over the river, so there was no way the people could get across. There was a slight flaw in the police's plan, however, and that was that the river had frozen over, and so the people could just walk across the ice. Once the police had failed to stop the people getting over the river, the Cossacks were called up to disperse the mobs. Just one problem. The Cossacks probably didn't care much about defending the Russian government. Whenever they were sent after the crowds, they did the minimal effort possible. In fact, one time a Cossack regiment straight up refused to attack a crowd of protesters, and the protesters cheered them for not attacking. And the Cossack regiment bowed to them for that. This was not going well for the government. The Tsar wasn't in the capital at the moment, he was in Belarus commanding the war, but he sent a telegram back to the city, ordering the authorities to use any means necessary to crush the dissent, and that meant the use of firearms, which, up until this point, had not been used against the demonstrators. But, on the night of the 10th of March, the Russian officers were informed that tomorrow they would be shooting at protesters. The next morning, Russian soldiers were ordered to fire at the crowds. One unit refused to shoot and mutinied. The mutiny was put down, and no other mutiny happened that day. There was firing on protesters in multiple locations. It seemed that the dynasty would survive this. On the morning of the 12th of March, Captain Lashkevich walked into the barracks of the training detachment of the Volhynsky Regiment. That morning, in those barracks, the entire course of history was going to be irrevocably altered forever. This detachment had killed more people than any other the day before, so he was going to order them to shoot more protesters. But when Lashkevich walked into the barracks, he was met with cries of, "We will not shoot! We will not shoot! We will not shoot!" Lashkevich wasn't giving up that easily. Remember the telegram the Tsar sent to the city, demanding the protests to be crushed? Well, Lashkevich took out a copy of the telegram and read it out to the barracks. The message was clear. Disobeying the order to attack protesters would mean disobeying an order from the Tsar himself, the highest authority in Russia. Were these soldiers really going to disobey an order from the Tsar himself? And the answer to that question, ladies and gentlemen, was yes. Captain Lashkevich would not walk out of those barracks alive. Either the soldiers killed him, or he shot himself. We don't know. But what we do know is that those troops of the Volhynsky Regiment stormed out of that building and woke up the soldiers of the Preobrazhensky and Litovsky regiments, who agreed to join their mutiny. Suddenly, there was a significant mutiny with a genuine chance of overthrowing the Tsar. They decided to go to the Vyborg district, an area so revolutionized that the police were too scared to leave the station. The only thing keeping them alive life was the fact that they had guns and the workers didn't. But that was about to change. The mutinying soldiers showed up in Vyborg and told the striking workers the location of every single arsenal in the district. And with that, the workers were armed. They hunted down the last holdouts of police and killed them all. And this was a story going on all over the city. Mutiny report after mutiny report after mutiny report piled up on the desks of the Moscow authorities. They put together a force of 6 supposedly loyal companies, but that force disintegrated every time it was sent to fight the revolutionaries. By the end of the day, the rebels controlled the city. All prisoners were released from prison, and the court building was burned. Military high command in Russia dispatched an army under General Ivanov to retake the city, but until they arrived, the Tsar had lost control of Petrograd. With the old regime thrown out, so everybody worth their salt sent representatives to the government building of the Russian Empire, the Tauride Palace. Trade unions, cooperatives and political parties all sent people there to try and get a stake in this new government. In the end, they set up an organization called the Petrograd Soviet. This would act as the city council of Petrograd, and in case you're wondering what their claim to power was, their claim was, because I said so. They decided to set up a food commission to regulate the supply of food to the city, and a workers' militia to replace the police force. Meanwhile, also in the Tauride Palace, was the Duma. Now the Duma was a government of Russia that had no real power, but the Tsar let it exist anyway because it looked like he was giving up power. The revolutionaries hadn't bothered to attack the Duma during the revolution, and so it was just sitting there in the palace deciding what to do. There were many in the Duma who wanted to create a constitutional monarchy, and others who just wanted a republic without a monarch. The Tsar had sent them an order to dissolve, but there were many in the revolutionary populace who wanted to use the Duma as a building block to form a new government. So the Duma had to decide whose orders to follow, the Tsar's or the people's. In the end, they did both. They officially declared the Duma dissolved, left the room, and met back up in the same building but in a different room as a group of private citizens. The Duma quickly elected a temporary committee to run Russia for the time being. What was their claim to power? Their claim was, because I said so. Although it should be noted that the temporary committee had basically no authority anywhere in Russia except for a little bit of power in the capital. True power lay with the aforementioned Petrograd Soviet, which was much more popular. I just want to stress how fast all of this happened. Before dawn, there was no mutiny going on against the government, and most of the city was under their control. By the end of the day, the entire garrison had mutinied. The government had lost complete control of the city, and people were trying to ram together a new government. Up until this point, the Tsar had been in Belarus fighting the war against Germany, but at this point, he decided he should probably return to the vicinity of the capital to see what was going on. His plan was to go to Tsarskoye Selo, a few miles from the city, but he never made it. 100 miles away from the city, he found that the next few stations along were controlled by revolutionaries, so instead, he changed course. He went for Pskov, where the military high command was. There, they discussed the recapture of Petrograd, but it was going to be difficult. The last of the troops in Petrograd that were loyal to the Tsar had deserted that morning. In the city, policemen were queuing up to be arrested to save themselves from the revolutionary mobs. There was no question about it. The revolutionaries had complete control of the city. However, the Duma committee knew there was still a threat of military attack, so they put together a military commission to restore order in the garrison, and use the garrison to protect the city from loyalists. A week after the first protest started, the revolution spread out of Petrograd. That day, revolution began in the city of Moscow. The entire garrison defected to the side of the revolutionaries. The city fell much easier than Petrograd. It was almost like the government knew they had no chance of holding out. So they gave up, and the revolution spread across the whole country as well. There was very little death and blood. The Duma Committee and Petrograd Soviet just telegrammed everyone to say that the Tsar was no longer in control, and that became true. Few people cared enough to risk their life to defend the autocracy that had oppressed them for hundreds of years. And those who were knew that there was no point trying. The people wanted the Tsar gone, and so did the soldiers. So, the Tsar lost control of the country in a matter of days. And it became clear there was no chance the Tsar could retake the capital. Remember that army that was sent to take back the city? Well, it arrived just a few miles outside the city and got no further. The loyalist soldiers started mingling with the revolutionary soldiers and became influenced by them. They decided they didn't want to attack the city anymore. The Russian Tsar looked on in dismay as his chances of retaking Petrograd withered away. Meanwhile in the city, the Petrograd Soviet, despite being far more popular than the Duma, decided to allow the Duma to form a provisional government to run the country. So they began negotiations with the Duma's temporary committee. In the end, the Duma agreed to the following conditions in exchange for the Petrograd Soviet consenting to the creation of a provisional government. The first condition was that there would be immediate preparations for a general election to elect a government of Russia. Then there would be a bunch of civil rights and freedoms and all that, like free speech and stuff. But there was one condition that piqued my interest. The provisional provisional government would not be allowed to disarm or remove from the city any soldiers that took part in the revolution. This was significant because it would mean that the provisional government would constantly be under threat. You see, it took those troops just a few hours to bring a 300-year dynasty to an end, and they could do it again even faster, and the provisional government would always be much less popular than the Soviet. So, if there was another revolution, then the provisional government was going first. But the Duma Committee had obtained permission from the Soviet to form a government, so they got ready to declare the new government. The Soviet also decided to greatly reform the military. A bunch of soldiers gathered in a room in the Tauride Palace and had a massive discussion about how to reform the army. They decided that the officers would no longer have control of the weapons. Instead, the soldiers would elect committees that would control the supply of arms. With the Tsar losing increasingly more power, many believed that the monarchy would be saved if the Tsar abdicated in favour of his son. They were convinced that everyone hated the Tsar, but not Tsarism itself. So Russian generals convinced the Tsar to abdicate in favour of his son, and he announced his plans to do exactly that. Then, a speech was given by a member of the Duma Committee in Petrograd, declaring the need for a constitutional monarchy. The speech was a disaster. Everyone hated the idea of keeping the monarchy around. The Tsar changed his plans, and instead abdicated for himself, but also his son as well. Nicholas had woken up that morning, expecting to rule Russia for the rest of his life. Later that night, he abdicated. It was the 9th day since the revolution began, and things were looking bleak for the royal family. With the Tsar abdicating for himself and his son, the only possible candidate to succeed him was his brother, Michael Romanov. Dozens of Duma members gathered in his apartment, half of them begging him to accept the throne and save the Tsars, half of them begging him to decline it. In the end, he declined the throne. The Romanov dynasty was over. Later that day, the provisional government took over the ruling of Russia. However, the provisional government had so little power, it was barely a government. The only reason it had any power was because it was backed by the Petrograd Soviet. On the 21st of March, the Romanov family were detained and sent to house arrest in the Urals. However, just because the Tsar was deposed, it didn't mean that the Russian Revolution was over. You see, in Switzerland, there was a man who'd worked his whole life for a Marxist revolution in Russia and the world. He was beginning to worry that he would not see revolution in his lifetime. He had no money to start a revolution, and no way to get back to Russia to do a revolution. But both problems would be solved when he was approached by the Germans, who wanted to send him back to Russia and give him a bunch of money. Russia was already losing the war against Germany. Now, the Germans were going to hit them with a weapon far more dangerous than any German army: Vladimir Lenin. 1 week after this video releases, there will be a Kahoot quiz live stream about the information in this video, so we'll see who is paying attention then. Remember the information from On the morning of the 12th of March, Captain Lashkevich walked into the barracks of the Volinsky Regiment. There he informed them that morning they were going to be shooting at protesters again. The troops refused. Either they shot him, or Lashkevich committed suicide. Either way, the mutiny had begun. The Volinsky Regiment got to work, recruiting other soldiers to their mutinies, and telling protesters where to find stockpiles of guns. By the end of the day, 160,000 soldiers would be part of the mutiny. By the end of the week, the central government would have lost control of the country. The replacement government that was set up was called the Provisional Government. However, this was barely a government. The workers' militia that had replaced the police force did not like them and could not be counted on to defend the regime if push came to shove. The Russian army did not like them and could not be counted on to defend the regime if push came to shove. They'd overthrown the last government easy peasy apple squashy, and they could do it again. The peasantry all just wanted a slice of their landlord's estate, which the Provisional Government did not want to give them. So the peasants did not like the Provisional Government and could not be counted on to defend the regime if push came to shove. So you may be wondering, how did the Provisional Government even last a week without getting overthrown? Well, it was because of an institution known as the Petrograd Soviet. They were the city council of the capital city of Russia, and they were actually popular. They used their popularity to make people obey the Provisional Government. But if the two governments ever threw hands, then the army would side with the Soviet. Nevertheless, while most places in Russia still had some influence from the Provisional Government, some were just electing councils to run the place without any Provisional Government influence. Meanwhile, on the war front against Germany and Austria, everything was going to hell. The soldiers were losing any and all discipline, disregarding orders from officers, and in some units they murdered people for talking in favour of war. Everyone in Russia wanted the war to end. But Russia had made a bunch of promises to the Allies, and the Provisional Government wanted to keep those promises, and that means they couldn't leave the war. Therefore, instead of leaving the war, they began trying to restore order in their army. Meanwhile, there would be the first of several uprisings against the Provisional Government. On the 1st of May, a letter was sent to the Allied allied governments, saying that the Soviet wanted the Russian people to oppose imperialist aims, as they wanted, quote, peace without annexations or contributions. However, the message came with a note from the provisional government attached, saying that Russia did intend to fulfill their obligations to the Allies, and it also said that the desire to continue the war had only flourished with the revolution. This was absolutely not correct, it was a lie. The people were furious. On the 3rd of May, 2 days later, a regiment of Finnish soldiers, fully armed, began demonstrating against this. They demanded the resignation of the guy that wrote that note, even though loads of people agreed to have that note sent. Other units joined in, and pretty soon, there were 25 to 30,000 soldiers demonstrating. And oh my god, I cannot imagine the utter terror felt by the provisional government. This was exactly how the Tsar got overthrown. However, shots had not been fired yet, and until they were fired, the government was not doomed yet. If they could keep things from escalating, then maybe everyone would go home. So the people from the Soviet gave a bunch of speeches, and convinced all the soldiers to go back to their barracks, and they all lived happily ever after. Until the next day, when more demonstrations occurred, this time by civilians and not by soldiers. They started off with demonstrations against Malyukov, the leader of the Cadet Party, the last non-socialist party in the government. He was also the guy who wrote that note. There were then a bunch of counter-demonstrations in favour of Malyukov. Garrison Commander Kornilov suggested they use force to crush this dissent. The government was more pragmatic, telling him to stand down. But just in case, he did order some units to mobilise anyway, to stand guard, just in case. And you'll never guess how those units reacted to those orders. The soldiers asked the Soviet whether or not they should follow that order. The Soviet responded by decreeing that no soldiers should be out on the street unless they said so or unless it was a routine operation. And the soldiers obeyed that order. After a couple of days, the protests stopped and everybody went home. With disaster averted, the provisional government agreed to put together a new cabinet. The Cadet Party, mentioned earlier, agreed to join this new cabinet under a few conditions. Notably, that the government agreed upon an offensive against Germany. Currently, their army was in a terrible state. Soldiers were deserting home in droves. The Russian army was collapsing. A successful offensive, the cadets believed, would halt or slow the disintegration of the army, which is a good idea, until you remember that the army was disintegrating in droves, and in some units, it was dangerous to speak in favour of launching an offensive. Minister for War, Alexander Kerensky, went round the army giving speeches to boost morale, which did work because he was so good, but as soon as he left, all morale in the Russian army went with him. The offensive began on the 1st of July, and there was some initial success, as the Austrians were demoralised, but then the Germans showed up to reinforce the Austrians, and everything went to heck. The offensive was intended to save the Russian war effort. It had the opposite effect. The failure of the offensive pushed the Russians out of Austrian territory entirely, and sped up the disintegration of the army. Then, in the capital city, there was a revolution against the government. If you want to see how that plays out, click on this video, appearing on the end screen now. It was the summer of 1917, and the Russian government was extremely unpopular. They had just launched a disastrous offensive on the Galician front that was supposed to boost morale if it succeeded, but it failed, and so now the entire Russian army was deserting in droves. In the wake of this disaster, among other reasons, the Russian Prime Minister and 4 of his cabinet ministers resigned. So with the Russian government just absolutely imploding, the people of Russia wondered if there was anybody who could replace them. The provisional government wasn't the only government in Russia. There was also a Soviet, which was essentially the City Council of Russia, but effectively it had just as much, if not more, power than the provisional government. What if, the people thought, that we could give all power to the Petrograd Soviet and the other city Soviets around Russia? That was even a Bolshevik slogan, all power to the Soviets, and the Bolsheviks were also gaining in popularity. They got 54% of the seats in the workers' section of the Petrograd Soviet, but they still didn't have a majority in the soldiers' section. So, some soldiers in Russia began planning armed demonstrations in favour of all power being given to the Soviets and taken away from the provisional government. Certain machine gunners went to other units to try to convince them to help them plan the armed uprising, and the Bolsheviks knew they had to stop this. You see, if these armed demonstrations did occur, then they could well escalate into a revolt. And the Bolsheviks knew that if this escalated into a revolt, then it would be bad news for them. You see, at least quite a lot of the people in these revolts would be calling not for the Soviet to take full power, but for the Bolsheviks to take full power. And why would this be a bad thing? Well, it's very simple. The Bolsheviks could have probably taken control of Petrograd if they wanted to. They were popular enough in the city that they could do that, But why didn't they? Because they were popular in Petrograd, but that's not the only place in Russia. The rest of Russia would turn against them, and the city would be besieged, and it would fall. The Bolsheviks didn't revolt yet because they weren't popular enough to do so. So the Bolsheviks sent people out to tell these troops not to join the armed demonstrations. A massive propaganda battle was waged throughout the day. Bolshevik representatives were sent out, giving speeches to the soldiers, telling them, do not join this armed protest that is being planned. But hotter heads prevailed, and by the 16th of July, armed demonstrations were occurring in the capital city of Russia in favour of all power to the Soviets. Soldiers and workers both took part in these protests. The Bolsheviks realised that they couldn't stop these protests, and so instead they urged all those protesting soldiers and workers to go straight to the Tauride Palace where the provisional government was and present their demands there. Other protesting workers and soldiers besieged the headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet and said, no, you are going to take power, and if you refuse to take power, we will make you take power, okay? They weren't asking the Soviet to become in charge of Russia. They weren't allowing the Soviet to become in charge of Russia. They were telling the Soviet, you're going to be in charge of Russia. But yet the Soviets still continually refused to take power. The government was helpless. All the soldiers in the city were either joining the protests and mutinying or refusing to defend the government. Their only hope was if loyalist units could return from the front and save them from certain doom. Supposedly, one of the protesting workers even yelled at a member of the Soviet saying, take power when it is offered to you, you son of a bitch! I didn't even know that word had a direct translation from English to Russian. There were many in the city who were calling for the active overthrowal of the provisional government, and this could happen at any time. They simply had to organise all these spontaneous protests and riots into an organised force where they could storm the Tauride Palace and arrest the provisional government. They could do it at any time if they could get organised and get together. A day after the uprising started, on the 17th of July, 20,000 revolutionary soldiers from the island of Kronstadt arrived in the city to support the rebellion. They went to Lenin's house and expected him to give a massive, rousing speech advocating the complete overthrow of the provisional government and putting the Bolsheviks in charge. Okay, these people weren't, all power to the Soviets. These people were in favour of all power to the Bolsheviks. Yet here's the thing, Lenin had a dilemma. Remember how earlier I said that if Lenin took power, all the people in Russia would team up and get rid of him? Exactly. Lenin knew that he couldn't use this to take advantage of this and overthrow the government, because that just wouldn't work. It was a doomed uprising where he would lose, but if he didn't overthrow the government and try to take control of Russia, he would also lose, because the Bolsheviks were going to get blamed for these protests. Many in the protests were Bolshevik supporters, and they were marching under Bolshevik slogans such as peace, land, bread, and all power to the Soviets. Therefore, if the provisional government survived, the Bolsheviks were going to get the blame for it. So there's going to be like a massive wave of anti-Bolshevik suppression. Lenin lost either way. Lenin, however, decided that his party could survive a wave of suppression. It could not, however, survive the entirety of Russia turning against them. So when he gave that speech to the 20,000 Kronstadt sailors, he was more restrained than they expected them to be, and it was disappointing. The crowd dispersed at the end. And remember how I said that they could have taken control of the government building? Had they tried? Well, that's the thing. They didn't try because this was completely disorganised. There was no way to organise all these groups into a coherent structure enough to storm the palace. There was no plan to storm the palace, and so they didn't. So eventually, loyalist units arrived from the front, and all the rebels either got bored and went home, or they got crushed by loyalist units. The revolution had failed. And now Lenin had another dilemma. You see, he had just been accused of being a German agent. As that wave of anti-Bolshevik suppression after the rebellion that I just mentioned. So he had to decide. Was he going to escape to Finland and not be put on trial? But that would imply that he was guilty if he was escaping. Or would he allow himself to be put on trial in the hope that the jury would acquit him? Well, he decided to escape to Finland to not get exiled, not get arrested, because he knew that there was little to no chance of getting a fair trial. Remember that offensive I mentioned at the start of the video? Well, Kerensky, the guy that organised that offensive, was made Prime Minister after this, and so Kerensky, as Prime Minister, decided to restore the death penalty in the Russian army, at least on the front. But the death penalty only became legal in theory. It was still not going to be tolerated among the soldiers. He also denied Finland's declaration of independence, and he resigned all his positions, but everybody begged him to come back, and so he said, okay, I'll come back, under the condition that I'm allowed to choose whoever I want to be in my cabinet. He also arrested several Bolshevik leaders, you know, for being German agents. The Bolsheviks had to go semi-underground for a bit after this. So in the next part of this series on the Russian Revolution, I am going to make a video about how the Bolsheviks overthrow the Russian government. And if you would like to see that, I'm going to put it on the end screen when I make the video, okay? Hi. Not sure if you saw the gunshot, it was quite fast. Anyway, in July of 1917, in the capital city of Russia, Petrograd, there was a revolt. And when I say revolt, I mean a disorganized mass of protests, aiming to overthrow the provisional government of Russia. These protests failed because the people that they wanted to be in charge of Russia refused to be in charge of Russia. So I suppose they all just either went home or got crushed by reactionary forces. But anyway, in the aftermath of this revolt, a guy called Kornilov was promoted to the supreme commander of the Russian army. But he only accepted this position under the condition that the government not be allowed to interfere with his commands. Then, when he became in charge of the Russian army, he immediately set up some of his cavalry in a place that wouldn't make much sense if you were going to war with the Germans, which they were at war with the Germans, but it would make quite a lot of sense if you were planning to launch an attack on, say, Moscow or Petrograd. This guy was plotting something. You see, this guy absolutely hated the Petrograd Soviet, which was officially the city council of Petrograd, but in practice it was like a sort of joint government, co-government with the provisional government, because that's how powerful it was. And he also hated the Bolshevik Party, and he was just itching for an excuse to march into Petrograd and eliminate the Soviet, eliminate the Bolshevik Party, hang Vladimir Lenin, hang all the leaders. He was more than willing to hang all the leaders of the Petrograd Soviet, or the Bolshevik Party. But here's the thing, he wanted to wait for provocation first, you know. There'd been a revolution in July, what if there was another revolution? And when the other revolution came, he was going to be ready. And he was going to go in, use that revolution as justification, and defeat the Bolsheviks. And this guy claimed not to want anything for himself, of course. He just wanted to save Russia from the evil Soviet. And we don't know whether or not this was true. Maybe, if he succeeded, it would have been a military dictatorship. Or maybe he genuinely just wanted to save Russia. We'll never know. He also thought maybe that instead of fighting my way to the capital, I can simply get the provisional government to let me into the capital. So he sent Kerensky a long list of demands that would have effectively given him complete control of the capital city of Russia. And so Kerensky read these demands and realised, oh my god, I probably shouldn't have promoted this guy. This guy's absolutely plotting something. He immediately sent Kerensky a telegram telling him that he was fired and asking his chief of staff to take command. But his chief of staff refused to take command instead. So, guess what happened? Kerensky realised he had to launch his coup now. So, he ordered his cavalry to march on Petrograd. But here's the thing. No one in Russia supported him. Or barely anybody in Russia supported him. The train station workers refused to send trains full of Kornilov's troops to the capital. And every time he arrived at a train station, his troops would be surrounded by loyal soldiers and loyal workers. Loyal to the government, that is. Yelling at his troops, "Don't attack the city! Call off the coup, don't do it!" They were encouraging his troops to either desert or defect or launch a mutiny or something, and all that yelling and propaganda had an effect. Lots of his troops did end up, deserting. Propagandists also infiltrated his army to try and convince his soldiers to desert, and that worked as well. Kornilov was losing a lot of men to desertion, and he wasn't getting any closer to the capital because, like I said, the train station workers weren't sending his troops there. And also, the telegraph workers also weren't transmitting the commands of his generals, so communication in Kornilov's army was just terrible. Meanwhile, in the capital city, the Soviet, who knew that Kornilov was probably coming for them, went to Kerensky and demanded that Kerensky completely and unconditionally crush Kornilov's revolt. The Bolsheviks also wanted to help put down this coup, so they were able to get the approval of several other political parties to rearm and re-legalise the Red Guard. The Red Guard was the self-defense military detachment of the Bolsheviks. And so now the Bolsheviks were armed. But it didn't really matter that the Bolsheviks were armed, because no fighting would be necessary against Kornilov. Every single one of his troops just deserted without a shot being fired. Remember all those people who were surrounding Kornilov's army and yelling at them? Infiltrating his troops, convincing them to desert? Yeah, that worked. Kornilov's army just melted away. But the coup still had a lot of consequences. It was great for the Bolsheviks, because now, not only did the Bolsheviks have their Red Guard armed and re-legalised, but also they'd become so much more popular. You know, quite a lot of that propagandising the workers to desert, and having the telegraph workers not transmit the communications, and having all those railroad workers not send the trains further, well, quite a lot of that had been orchestrated by the Bolsheviks. Like, they'd convinced the workers to do that. I mean, not all of it was orchestrated by the Bolsheviks, obviously, but the Bolsheviks did also get their Red Guard ready to defend the city. It means the Bolsheviks are so much more popular. And what does that mean? It means that the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, the two most important cities in Russia, elected a Bolshevik majority. So next week I'm going to release, part 5, I think? Yeah, I think it is part 5. Next week I'm going to release part 5 of my Russian Revolution series. And it'll probably be on the October Bolshevik Revolution, unless I find something else to talk about that came between September and November. Still, stick around for that. Bye. The year was 1917, and the Russian Revolution was well underway. With the Eastern Front drawing troops away from the Western Front, everybody could see that Russia was about to completely change the entire course of history forever. Workers were seizing control of their factories. Peasants were murdering their landlord. Soldiers were in mutiny. One Russian general launched a military coup, and it failed. Most people believed that this military coup would have no long-term effects on the world. But when the coup failed, one man realised that now was his time to strike. You see, the Bolshevik Party took much of the credit for the failure of the coup, and so their popularity skyrocketed. In 3 months, they went from the 4th to the most popular party in Moscow. Vladimir Lenin could see the writing on the wall. It was now or never. So preparations began. The Bolsheviks went to the Petrograd Soviet and told them that they wanted to form the Military Revolutionary Committee, with the objective of doing a military revolution. The Petrograd put together this committee with the intention of overthrowing the provisional government. This committee was mostly dominated by the Bolsheviks, but there were 12 socialist revolutionaries and 4 anarchists. As they began plotting revolution, the first thing the MRC had to think about was the Petrograd garrison. Calling them a garrison makes them sound more violent than they actually were. There was only one circumstance in which this garrison could, be reliably counted on to fight somebody. Okay, everybody, great news! We are going to be sending you to the front! You're telling us that you want us to push our lives at risk. That's right! You're going to have to actually go to war and fight some Germans. How does that sound? Despite the fact that they didn't know how reliable the garrison was going to be in the revolution, they still decided it was worth getting the garrison on side. So they asked a bunch of people from the garrison, and most of the soldiers agreed to join the revolution. So, the MRC declared that it had full control over the garrison, and sent people out to take command. They also declared that no high command order was valid unless it was signed by the Military Revolutionary Committee. The garrison commander, Colonel Polkovnikov, could not accept this and chose not to recognise MRC control over the garrison. To the garrison, the next thing the MRC had to think about was the Peter and Paul Fortress. This Peter and Paul Fortress had so many guns in it. Whoever could control that arsenal had a massive advantage. So, Trotsky went over to the fortress and gave a huge speech, and that was all it took. The entire Peter and Paul Fortress switched over to the side of the revolution. The Military Revolutionary Committee was winning. Until now, the provisional government had been confident that they could crush the Bolshevik revolt. Suddenly, they realised everything was going to hell for them. Workers from the factories were getting trained by the Bolsheviks and the MRC to fight with a rifle, and then joining the force known as the Red Guards. On the eve of the revolution, the Military Revolutionary Committee had an estimated 20,000 Red Guards at its disposal. The government looked at the situation with terror and began to take action. First, they sent troops to a Bolshevik printing shop and shut down the Bolsheviks' newspaper. The Military Revolutionary Committee was quick to react. They sent troops, retook the shop, and by 11 a.m. that same day, the newspaper was back on. The pro-Bolshevik cruiser Aurora was ordered to evacuate the city and leave to the Baltic Sea. But, under orders from the MRC, the cruiser stayed. The next day, revolution began. More pro-Bolshevik cruisers were brought into the city. Key buildings were occupied by the Red Guards, and telephone lines were cut. The Red Guards took control of the entire capital city of Russia in one day. There was so little fighting because very few people actually cared to fight for the provisional government. Only 5 revolutionary sailors and 1 Red Guard died. Think about that for 1 second. The entirety of human history from that point on has just been completely changed, with no way of turning it back. And only 6 people had to die. Here's the thing. As long as there was a revolution, there must be a counter-revolution. And in Russia, there was no different. Former premier of the pro-government, Kerensky, fled the capital city of Russia after the revolution and found the Russian army. There he met Russian General Krasny. Krasny put together an army, and together the pair hopped on a train and went back to Petrograd. They were going to retake the city and end this Bolshevik revolution almost before it began. The Bolsheviks had taken the city without a fight. Now they were going to have to fight tooth and claw to keep it. And it was 1917 in Russia, and the country was rapidly falling under Bolshevik control. The Red Guards were launching coups all over the country, taking control of city after city after city. On the 5th, Tallinn fell. On the 7th, Petrograd, Minsk, Novgorod, and 2 other cities all fell to successful Bolshevik coups. On the 8th, 4 more cities became under Bolshevik control. But perhaps there was one chance of preventing the Bolsheviks from conquering Russia. After the Bolshevik Revolution in Petrograd, the premier, Alexander Kerensky, fled the city and met up with commander of the Northern Front, General Cheremissov. Cheremissov! The Bolsheviks are taking over the country! We have to go back to Petrograd right now and occupy the city! Oh, I'm sorry. Aren't you the guy who chose not to make me Supreme Commander of the entire Russian army? Yeah, sorry, the army doesn't meddle in political affairs. Political affairs? This is a revolution! This is what the army's for! God damn it, why do I pay you? Not anymore, you don't, you former world leader. I'll help you. Really? Yeah, well, I'll go get my division together, we'll hop on a train, go straight back to Petrograd. Oh, thank God you're a lifesaver. Hopefully not to the Bolsheviks, though. So there it was. Kerensky, Krasnov, and 700 Cossacks were barreling down a train straight towards Petrograd. If they won, Vladimir Lenin would be merely a chapter in the history books. If they lost, he'd be a bookshelf. The stakes were high, but apparently, apathy among the Russian army was higher. So most of my soldiers either didn't want to fight the Bolsheviks, or they were too far away to be reached. I was only able to get you 700 men. But 700? The Bolsheviks have tens of thousands of troops in the city. Yeah, well, we've lost battles, we've outnumbered the enemy several times to 1. The Bolsheviks can lose battles like that too. You're the worst motivational speaker ever. They had the train driver turn the train up at full speed. That way, when they went to the train station, the Bolsheviks couldn't stop them. On the 9th of November, they occupied the city of Gatchina. There, they asked for recruits to join them. Their only chance of winning was for troops to join them against the Bolsheviks. But all the recruits they got amounted to several officers, which contributed 2 planes to drop propaganda over Petrograd, and 1 armoured car. Not nearly enough. The exact same day that Krasnov took Gatchina, 5 more cities fell under Bolshevik control. 10th of November, Krasnov advanced on Tsarskoye Selo, a few miles away from Petrograd. His artillery fired 2 shells into the city, and that was enough to scare off the Bolshevik garrison. Marching into the city, they met the 16,000 strong Tsarskoye Selo garrison. If this garrison agreed to join them, they would have enough troops to win the war. But it was not to be. The garrison declared neutrality. It seemed that nobody wanted to join Kerensky. Krasnov may have taken over Tsarskoye Selo, but on the exact same day, Rostov and 2 other cities fell under Bolshevik control. Not only that, But the new regime was getting ready for the attack. Workers poured out of their factories to take the day off and dig trenches in the outskirts of Petrograd, setting up barbed wire. Trotsky then began filling those trenches with his Red Guards. It seemed that Kerensky and Krasnov's coup was doomed from the beginning. They had no infantry, just Cossacks who rode horses. But when all hope seemed lost, there was one last ray of hope for Kerensky. And no, I'm holding up two fingers. The Junkers. The Junkers were officers in training. These people wanted to launch a revolution and take back control of the city from the Bolsheviks. They broke into a garage and seized some armoured cars. They seized the central telephone exchange, taking control of all communications in the city. I don't know if Krasnov knew that there was a revolution going on in the city. Presumably they must have told him in advance, but regardless of whether or not he knew, he didn't make any move to attack Petrograd and support the uprising, which is a shame because attacking Petrograd on that day might have been his only chance of winning the battle, if there was ever any chance of winning the battle. But here's the thing, the evening before the Junker coup began, a guy was walking about with a detailed copy of the mutiny's plans on him. The Bolsheviks caught that guy, read the plans, and now knew every single move that the Junkers were going to make before they made them. And so, the telephone exchange was retaken, and then all the schools were laid siege to and occupied. The Bolsheviks taught those students exactly what it was like to go to school in America. 400 people were killed and wounded during the storming of just one of those schools. We now move to the 12th of November, 5 days after the Bolsheviks took control of Russia. On that day, Smolensk and 2 other cities came under Bolshevik power. It was also the day that Krasnov finally decided to launch his attack on Petrograd. His 700 Cossacks assaulted the Pulkovo Heights just outside the city. His advance was slowed by a marsh that they had to cross, and significant Red Guard forces were deployed to his flanks to outflank him. And on top of that, the Tsarskoye Selo garrison of 16,000 people threatened to attack his men if they didn't cease fighting. Krasnov was forced to withdraw his forces. He ordered a retreat back to Gatchina, out of Tsarskoye Selo. The Cossacks decided to hand Kerensky over to the Bolsheviks. Kerensky was forced to disguise himself as a sailor and sneak into exile. Kerensky would spend the next couple of decades moving between France and the USA, spending a year in Australia when his second wife died. He would spend the last 25 years of his life in the USA, teaching history and giving lectures. Could you imagine being a former head of state of Russia, spending your golden years teaching history in the USA? He would die in 1970, aged 89. Kerensky may not have won the war, but he outlived Vladimir Lenin by 46 years. Krasnov would be arrested by the Bolsheviks, but he was released. He went south and became ruler of the Don Republic. He would become a commander in the Russian Civil War. But after the White Movement was defeated, he lived in exile for the next 20 years. He would support Nazi Germany during Operation Barbarossa, in which he organised Cossacks against the Soviet Union. The communist authorities would capture him a second time. He was not fortunate enough to be released. Krasnov's army of Cossacks would lose military discipline and most of them would end up deserting. Over the next few days, Tambov, Orel, Perm, Pskov, Moscow and Baku would fall to Bolshevik coups. But despite all this success, Bolshevik victory was not guaranteed. They were still losing a war against Germany, and the Russian army was completely collapsing. Hundreds of thousands of men were deserting home in droves back to their farm just to murder their landlord. Russia was losing war to the Central Powers, and their entire armed forces was collapsing. People were rising up all over Russia to stop the Bolsheviks. During the time of the provisional government, Ukraine had declared autonomy. Now, they declared complete independence. Lenin had to make peace with Germany so he and Trotsky could focus on the civil war that everybody knew was about to start. The next video in my Russian Revolution series will be out 1 week from today. Before dawn on the 12th of March, a Russian officer walked into his barracks to give orders. But little did he know that he would not survive for the next 30 minutes. The Russian Revolution had begun. The emperor of the largest country in the world was overthrown so fast that people blinked and missed it. There was a second revolution in July, which failed. Then there was a military coup in September, which failed. And the Bolsheviks took much of the credit for defeating that military coup, so they surged in popularity and decided that it was time for them to launch their own revolution. So they did. There was a coup in Tallinn, a coup in Petrograd, and a coup in Moscow. Many people believe that the October Revolution was just one revolution. And within a matter of days, much of European Russia was under Bolshevik control. The Bolsheviks sent a delegation to negotiate peace with Germany, and then they lost an election. So they used their substantial military force to make sure they stayed in power anyway. With their position in power briefly secured, they now had to deal with rebel groups rising up against them. A few months prior, Ukraine had declared autonomy. Now, they were declaring full independence. So, a Bolshevik force departed from Kharkov to take Kiev. Due to the numerous workers' revolutions in Ukraine, the Bolsheviks were able to take town after town after town. The Ukrainian army fell back to Kiev in time to crush rebellion, but the city fell to the Red Guards. So with that, it seemed Bolshevism had won. They had taken over Ukraine, but the defeated Ukrainian army was returning to the city, and they brought with them the armies of the German Empire and Austria-Hungary. You see, Ukraine had concluded a peace treaty with the Central Powers. One of the terms of that treaty was that the German Empire would kick the Bolsheviks out of Ukraine. So in they went. The Soviet government in Ukraine fled across the Dnieper faster than a very fast thing. Germany occupied all of Ukraine, with its military becoming the de facto government. And that wasn't the only problem suffered by the Bolsheviks. A Cossack named Alexei Kaledin became ruler of the Don region, and he offered sanctuary to anybody opposing the Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, a group of Tsarist generals announced that they were forming a volunteer army to, quote, defend the people of South and Southeastern Russia. As recruits started flowing in, they quickly went from 0 to 3,000 men. The Bolshevik army was dispatched to deal with these problems. Kaledin was defeated, the Tsarists were sent running. The volunteer army decided to join the Cossack forces, holding out in Ekaterinodar. But by the time they arrived there, the Cossacks had fled, and the city had fallen to the Bolsheviks. The volunteer army was able to establish communication with the surviving Cossacks. Together, they agreed to unite their two forces and attempt to retake Ekaterinodar. Their 9,000 men assaulted 30,000 Bolshevik troops in the city. The fighting lasted 4 days. Even their leader, General Kornilov, was killed. The survivors of the volunteer army relocated to the Don, where thousands more Cossacks joined their ranks, and thousands more went into open revolt against the Bolsheviks. As Germany occupied Rostov, Lenin realized he had lost control of the Don region. In just a couple of months, the Bolsheviks had gone from almost certainly going to become the government of Russia to getting beaten bloody in Ukraine by Germany and getting pummeled in the Caucasus by Cossacks. Romania then invaded and annexed Bessarabia. Soon, this civil war would escalate to the point where all of Siberia was going to war against the Bolsheviks, and white troops were 300 miles from Moscow. This was the Russian Civil War, a war which would kill almost 9 million people, and I would argue had just as great an effect on the outcome of history as the First World War. Come back next week for the next installment in the Russian Revolution series. What? The year is 1918, and Russia is being carved up. Germany rips from them Ukraine, parts of Belarus, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. But the troubles weren't over yet. Hi, this is Editing Ben. I just want to apologise in advance for the French horn in the background. My brother's playing it. The Bolshevik Party, newly ruling Russia, couldn't simply get to taking back Ukraine and all those other places they lost. No. You see, there were multiple armies rising against them. First, we have the Volunteer Army in the Caucasus. They were a group of Tsarists ready to take back the country from Bolshevism. They launched their attack on Yekaterinodar and they were defeated. But then they launched another attack a few months later, and this one succeeded. Gradually, They took over the entirety of the North Caucasus, and by the beginning of 1919, they were ready to launch a northward offensive. In the east, the Czechoslovakian Legion, which had been fighting for Russia during the First World War, had been permitted to leave. It was going all the way around the world to France, and then back to Czechoslovakia. But on the way home, they fell out with the Bolsheviks. Battles and skirmishes began between them, and the situation escalated massively. Pretty soon, the Czechoslovakians weren't even going back to Vladivostok anymore. They were going to Moscow, as they occupied the entire Trans-Siberian Railway, the most significant piece of infrastructure in all of Russia. And this great victory inspired millions, or at least hundreds of thousands, of people to join the White Movement against the Bolshevik Party. Pretty soon, those groups of people united to form an anti-Bolshevik government ruling the vast majority of Russia. Finally, in Estonia, well, the people there had just finished fighting a brutal war of independence from both Germany and Russia. Estonia allowed a man called Yudenich, who was a former general of Tsarist Russia, to build up an army there, ready for an attack on Moscow. So now, we have three groups of people opposing the Bolsheviks. In the south, we have the Volunteer Army under General Denikin, planning a three-pronged offensive to take Moscow. In the east, we have a Russian government under Kolchak, planning another offensive against the Bolsheviks. In the northwest, we have Yudenich, planning his offensive to take Petrograd. In 1919, all three of these armies would assault the Bolshevik positions. Tune into part 3 of this video series to see a major war erupt all over Russia. A war so brutal, a historian could go back in time and mistake one of the battles there for a battle in World War I. Welcome to the Russian Civil War. The year was 1919, and Red Russia was under attack from all sides. In the east, the Russian state under Admiral Kolchak began its offensive, with an intent of destroying the new regime once and for all. They stormed into the city of Ufa, but their success wouldn't last. Bolshevism retook the city pretty quickly, and they went on the offensive, pushing the White Army back. From then on, it was all downhill. Meanwhile, in the south, Denikin ordered a three-pronged assault to take the Bolshevik positions. One of his generals, General Wrangel, fought the Bolsheviks at the Battle of, get this, Velikonoyaz Kraya. They've changed the place name now, but at the time the town was called Velikonoyaz Kraya. After seeing some success, they were ordered to move further north and converge on the city of Moscow. The Ukrainian anarchists and the Russian Bolsheviks at this time had been fighting each other, so they were caught completely off guard when the White Army stormed up north, and both of them got pushed back. Denikin's forces pushed them up to the Dnieper River and crossed it. The Bolsheviks were pushed back towards Moscow and got within 300 miles of the city. Meanwhile in the north, the third offensive began, as General Yudenich, who'd been building up his forces in Estonia, finally stormed across the border and made for St. Petersburg. Military reinforcements that were desperately needed to fight Denikin were sent to the north to fight Yudenich. By the time Yudenich arrived in St. Petersburg, he was outnumbered 3-1 and he was forced to pull back to Estonia. When he arrived back in Estonia, the Estonian army immediately disarmed him and signed a peace treaty with the Bolsheviks. Most of his men went into exile. In the south, despite getting so close to St. Petersburg, Denikin, with his invasion of Ukraine, had overstretched his forces way too much. And now it was coming back to bite him. 100,000 new recruits and conscripts were sent to reinforce the Bolshevik army. And that was it. No hope left for him. Denikin was pushed back by the Bolsheviks and the anarchists, all the way out of Russia and back to just Crimea. As Denikin resigned, his last few men got ready to hold out. In the east, Kolchak had lost control of his government and had been executed. But here's the thing. There was still a threat to the Bolshevik regime, that threat being Poland. They had invaded Ukraine in the west. Tune in next week to see Bolshevism fight off Poland, Wrangel, and Semenov. Goodbye.